Okay, cool. So I deliberately made my bio kind of short because I need every second. This presentation is probably going to be a bit of a change of pace from the rest of the conference, not only because we're dealing with some stuff that's really on the border of classics, but also because I've got way too much material to fit into 20 minutes. But I'll do my best. Where are we? Yes, okay. So what are we looking at here? This is a whole bunch of classical Latin poetry. And hopefully, why video, no play? Broken up into tiny little chunks and then arranged by the computer according to the similarity of the fine lexicogrammatical structure. And we can see that, for example, all of the epicists kind of cluster together, and it's a 3D cluster because sometimes you can't see where clusters are sitting until you like rotate stuff around. And the works cluster by sort of general theme. It's just looping now. So the epicists are with the epicists. Ovid's off by himself, but all of Ovid's work clusters together. So he's got a style, whether he's writing the Met or whether he's writing the Amores. Virgil's eclogues are out by themselves, whereas the Georgics blend in a bit with the Aeneid. And it's all like super interesting stuff. Some people call this kind of approach a distant reading. And like, I love it because it's 3D and you can like whoosh through the poetry, like taste the verse. But the question that it suggests is like, actually why? So there's no classics professors that are going to be like shaking in their little tenured booties by the profound insights that I've just discovered, that epic's a bit like epic, right? And that Ovid has his own style. So while I love computers, I really am coming here today with my classics hat on. I do have a classics degree. I promise they check before they let me in. And so computers are useful if and only if they're of scholarly use. So for me, I want to use them if they can help me to see things better, or if they can tell me something that I didn't already know. So unlike that first visualization, if you like. So here are some tricks I did. So this is pretty much a tricks presentation where I'm just going to run through a bunch of stuff. I'm doing an MPhil by publication, which lets you be all like ADHD and go and like pick random different things to work on for like a few months. But the approaches are broadly in these two categories. So let's have a look at some stuff for seeing things better. So before I could do that, I needed a few prerequisites. The first and most important thing I needed was a set of digital editions. If I'm going to computer these poems, I'm not typing them in myself. And I really wanted full scansion for them because it's really annoying to automatically scan them. That's like super hard to code, and someone else has already done it. So for digital humanists that are working on Latin poetry, these two sites are indispensable, and it's not too much to say that they're the cornerstone of pretty much everything I've done. I've built like a huge amount of code, but without this original data, it would have taken me an extra year to start to gear up because I would have had to do this. So Musisque Deoque and Pericerto, they're from the same team, a bunch of super nice people in Italy. And they go from the earliest classical poetry all the way through to the humanists. So it's a really great resource. So the first thing that I had to code, because I'm talking about poetry, is a phonetic representation, because you can't, well, you can. I don't want to talk about poetry absent from sound. Latin poetry was written to be read as well as spoken, we can infer that by the distance between clausal elements, for example. But it is definitely written to be heard. There's that famous poem of like Virgil striking Augustus and his wife dumb with the force of his eloquence. And there is some open source software kind of available. And I was excited. I'm like, yeah, great. I can just use this like classical language toolkit stuff. I've got some, as a linguist, I've got some problems with their full IPA transcription there. Like I don't think that I think a dental T, the T with the little square duver, is a bit of an articulatory goal rather than something that was likely spoken. And anyway, that's not the big problem that I have with it. My first problem is that I want a simpler representation, because I don't really need all of those extra like hard phonological decorations. But my biggest problem is that it has a series of systemic errors. And so there are three different kinds. So what we're looking at now are just some random bits of poetry. The middle line of each triplet is phonetified by them, and the last line of each triplet is phonetified by my code. So the red errors are where they've ignored elision. That's the thing that they could have done, but they didn't. And for prose, doesn't matter. For poetry, it's super important. The blue errors are where they've missyllabalized. They have a systemic problem with the way that they've coded this up, in that they're too keen to form diphthongs. If you see U next to I in Latin, 95% of the time, it's going to be 2 syllables. There is a diphthong, but it's like hen's teeth. So they aggressively form it when they shouldn't. And so in the second line, proluit, and iopas, not iopas. The last series of errors that they make, they misplace stress. The rules for stress in Latin are fairly simple, although there are a bunch of edge cases. And normally I wouldn't care, but in the analysis of hexameter, I need sometimes to look at the conflict between spoken stress and metrical accent. So what I did was I realized that from the MQDQ data, I've got the scansion. And so if I've got a scanned line, I know how many syllables there should be. So by combining the MQDQ data with the raw data, although it's, tons and tons of code, I can use a combination of this CLTK code and my new code, and job done, good enough for research work. So now I've got working phonetification of Latin and correct allocation of stress and syllables. So cool. So let's start with a very simple trick. I take working with Latin poetry, like even scanning it by hand is a huge pain in the butt. So computer do it, easy. So it'll just take any bit of poetry and it'll produce a correct phonetic pronunciation, correctly stressed and accented, and also show me that those third lines show me all of the feet. So for example, erat in the first line comprises the syllables that finish the first foot and then have the onset of the second foot. And so we can see after erat, there is a strong caesura in the second foot, whereas in the first line, the caesura, the end of mediamque, falls in the tail of the third foot. It's what we might call a weak caesura. And it's all just there for looking at, whereas to scan it by hand is super annoying. The other reason you want this scansion is because the lengths of final A's and O's, for example, have a huge semantic difference when you're trying to understand the poem. A long A will be, say, ablative if you're first declension, completely different to a short A, which might be nominative or neuter plural or whatever the hell. So, okay. I mean, that's a fairly trivial application of the code once you've got the code. Like, that was the hard bit, right? Still super useful in my view. So let's have like something a little bit more challenging. So there's this idea in poetry that certain syllables might have certain associations. So P's might be associated with grief, from pectore plungere, or S's might be associated with either contempt or anger. Sulpicia, servia, filius, filia. Oh, sorry, Sulpicia. And so if you wanted to go looking for those, rather than just going through line by line, it'd be cool if the computer could help me out. So I wrote a quick thing that picks a phoneme or a set of phonemes, looks at their frequency in the actual text, and then colors up the lines based on the frequency. Now, you've got to use like a little bit of boring undergraduate stats because some consonants are more common in general, which means that you need more of them for them to be like unusually many, let's say. And so we do a thing called Z-score, doesn't matter. And that looks like this. So I pick the K sound, and remember I've got a phonetic representation, and I look for lines that have more Ks than usual. Sorry, phonemic Ks, right? So a C is the most obvious one in Latin, but the software will also pick up the K in quoque, or the K in dextra, or qui cumque. So it's smart enough to work out like the phonemic value rather than just the orthographic value. And so using that, I can now pick a bit of poetry that I want to look through. So say I wanted to troll through the Aeneid for things that had a lot of Ks. It's much easier just to color it up like this, scroll through and look for red bits rather than go through line by line and try and count them, especially when the letter K is never going to be written on the page. Another cool thing I can do is some of the analysts have suggested that different vowel sounds might have different associations. So the open vowels, the A, E, O, are maybe more melodic, right? And the high or closed vowels, I, U, I in Latin, like the Y, the Greek Y, not very common, might be more constricted, sort of less melodic. And so at the start of 5.1, this story kind of checks out because it's a beautiful melodic passage at the start of one of Ovid's sex poems, where he's talking about how it's like a nice summer day and he's lounging around on his bed and just chilling out and the windows are open and it's like really nice, and then it goes on and on and on. I'm not endorsing any of these theories at the moment. So I'm actively researching some of this stuff, but I've not yet made up my mind. At the moment, I'm just talking about tools. So, okay, that's cool. Now let's try a really hard one. So for this trick, I thought, all right, what I would like is to start looking through and try and see how the classical poets used what I'm going to insist on calling rhyme, even though it's somewhat heretical to claim that the classical poets do this. Code name, Reading Rainbow. So the plan is I'm going to find positional rhymes. So looking at, say, the penultimate word in a line versus the penultimate, or maybe the caesura in a pentameter or a hexameter versus the end of the line. I'm going to automatically assign the color based on the vowels because I want it to be deterministic, because eventually I want to train myself to just be able to look through the colored up poem and try and notice some kind of relationship between the colors and maybe the feeling of the line. And then I'm just going to go and try and do some noticing. After I've done some noticing, I'll then go and try and do hypothesis testing and a whole bunch of stuff. But we'll start with the noticing. So I'm going to fly through this bit. How do we know if things rhyme? Because I need to score stuff, right? And so linguists have this phonetic idea of the position of a vowel in your mouth. And if you say e, u, r, u, e, but really, really fast, e, u, r, e, then you can start to feel it moving around in your mouth, right? From front to back and down and back and up. And it's not just a theoretical model, it's based on the frequency combination of what they call formants. They're the two fleshy chambers that make up your vocal apparatus. And the combination of the resonant frequencies as you change them with your muscles gives you a unique point on this frequency map. So I kind of like, okay, well, I'll approximate that by allocating the vowels to positions and code it up. And this is just because I need to give things a score so that the computer can assess the goodness of a rhyme. Like, we can all do it because we were read nursery rhymes from when we were children. But unfortunately for a computer, it's not so easy. So lots of boring work, no one cares. But what does it look like? It looks like this. So this is some of the amores again. So Ovid, in this case, he loves to rhyme, especially the pentameter, the caesura, the pentameter caesura with the end of line. So talos meos, for example. But what I sort of discovered, which was kind of weird, is that his most common rhymes aren't at the word that ends the line. So ripas and aquas, sure. Refugi solutis, yeah. But what he does much more commonly is he rhymes the penultimate. So Keralia Mendacia. There's not, in this particular passage, there's not a ton of them. But when you run the numbers, there are. And the other thing that it'll do is to go and dig out bits of rhyme, like ones that score highly, so I can go and check them out. And so that's going to be that's currently my active research project. And so I'm nearing the end of the noticing phase, and I'll now enter the hypothesis testing phase, but that'll be a story for another day. Yeah. So moving on though, so that was all noticing things, right? That was the computer as a tool to augment my eyes as a poetry scholar. Now I'm going to talk about the other thing that computers are good at, which is to analyze lots and lots of variables all at once. So this is a stylometric investigation that I performed, which is now no longer a part of my life, and I feel pleased about that. That was the sort of last 18 months of my master's working on this one problem, and it's a cool problem. It's a 15th century manuscript of Silius Italicus that was found, and then there's a bit missing. So a 12,000 line poem, and then 81 lines that were missing in the original manuscript, now lost, which then just suddenly turned up in 1508, like, oh, found these. And so since then, it's been a matter of debate as to whether they're genuine. So I analyzed the style in 3 different ways, because what I want is to try and have multiple ways in which this passage may or may not be weird. So the first thing I thought about was, all right, what about borrowing? What about lines from which he's explicitly based something on, e.g. a line of the Aeneid? And this is one of the areas where I use some software that's not mine. And there's a bunch of limitations that are too long to go into. But essentially, it aims at finding lines in text A that allude to, as in steal at least 2 content words from text B. And Silius does this with Virgil a lot. And so the claim in favor of authenticity was that, okay, yes, it does it a lot, but is it unusually a lot? And so by doing the analysis, we can say, oh, hey, guess what? It is unusually a lot. So the scholarly intuition was that this seems like, even for Silius, it's too much. And that's a hypothesis which was then tested with this software. So that's kind of like coarse structure. Now for fine structure, we go back to the thing which was at the start of the presentation, which is looking at the lexicogrammatical style, looking at the tiny parts that make up the words. So like ELL or IUS or IUM. And we break up all of these poems into tiny little bits, and the computer positions them automatically on this plot, and then the labels are added afterwards. And what that tells us is, this is where this plot is useful, because it wasn't useful before, is that the additamentum, I'm going to CSI zoom, the additamentum, which is the point marked addit, is over in Virgil land, like way over, compared to pretty much all of the rest of Silius, which again supports the scholarly intuition that it's more closely based on Virgil than on Silius. And the last thing I did, and as far as I know, I'm the first person in the world to get this to work, which sounds impressive until I tell you that as far as I know, I'm the second person in the world ever to try it, is to analyze metrical style. So just using metrical features, can I find an authorial fingerprint? And it turns out yes. So you ignore the words, you just look at the way the author uses metre, and that is enough to classify authors very, very strongly. So I looked at a bunch of standard metrical features, which are the ones on your screen right now. And what we do is we compare how often those features are used. So for example, the second foot weak caesura, in the sample we're looking at, there are none, whereas normally they occur about 12% of the time. Then we do some stats magic, which produces a thing called the Mahalanobis distance, doesn't matter. It's a score that rates how unusual that is. So the difference in percentages by itself is not a great way to compare things because of stats. But if we consider the correlations, then we can normalize for all of that and work out whether this percentage difference actually matters. And so in this case, the most strange features are the first 4 or so. And so now every passage in the poem can be ranked according to its weirdness. And again, the additamentum, not actually the metrically weirdest passage in the whole poem, but a huge outlier. The only passage that is weirder is a catalogue of troops in Book 8, which is crazy and ask me about it over a beer. But still certainly an outlier at sort of the 99.9+ % level. So that in combination, all these 3 analyses, all of that formed maybe a quarter of a 12,000 word article in which I did a whole bunch of normal classics, quote unquote, with philology and looking at transmission and this, that, and the other. But what we've seen here was the new bit, kind of. And when we combine that triple weirdness, then it's not genuine, which is kind of cool. Like that's a little like literary mystery, I suppose. And I make that still under 25 minutes, which means that I don't get murdered.